The morning assembly bell clanged across Fort Huachuca's dusty parade ground, its harsh bronze voice cutting through the Arizona heat like a blade through hide. Margaret Whitmore stood at the edge of the formation, her dark wool dress already damp with sweat despite the early hour. 23 children arranged themselves in perfect lines before her, their faces scrubbed clean, but their eyes holding secrets she could not yet read. Colonel Thaddeus Kane emerged from the headquarters building, his boots striking the packed earth with military precision. The silver eagles on his shoulders caught the September sun, and Margaret noticed how every child's spine straightened at his approach. Even the youngest, a girl of perhaps 6 years, stood rigid as a fence post. "Miss Whitmore," Kane's voice carried the authority of a man accustomed to absolute obedience. "You will find our educational standards here considerably more demanding than those soft Eastern establishments from which you've come. These children are being prepared for a harsh world, not coddled into weakness." Margaret's left hand trembled slightly, a condition that had plagued her since childhood, growing worse under stress. She clasped it firmly behind her back, meeting Kane's steel-gray gaze without flinching. "I understand completely, Colonel. Discipline and learning shall go hand in hand." "Indeed they shall," Kane gestured toward the formation. "You see before you the future of this territory. Officers' children, settlers' offspring, even a few Apache young ones we're civilizing. Each name on your roster represents a sacred trust." He paused, his eyes narrowing. "A trust that demands absolute accountability." The enrollment sheet in Margaret's other hand felt suddenly heavy. 23 names in careful script, each representing a small face before her. She had memorized them all during the long train journey west. Samuel Morrison, age 12, son of Captain Morrison. Little Mary Fletcher, 7 years old, daughter of the post surgeon. Joseph Running Bear, 10, one of 3 Apache children who lived in the mission quarters. "Every week," Kane continued, his voice dropping to a tone that made the children lean forward slightly, "I will review your attendance records personally. Every absence must be accounted for. Every failure to appear must be explained in writing and signed by myself." His smile contained no warmth. "We have had difficulties with previous teachers who failed to maintain proper oversight." Margaret felt a chill despite the mounting heat. "What sort of difficulties, sir?" "The kind that result in immediate dismissal and forfeiture of all wages." Kane's hand rested on his service revolver, a casual gesture that nonetheless conveyed unmistakable threat. "You see, Miss Whitmore, children have a tendency to wander, to disappear into the desert or fall victim to accident. A teacher's primary duty is to ensure that such tragedies never occur under her watch." The tremor in Margaret's hand worsened. She had taken this position out of desperate necessity. Her previous post in Boston had ended in scandal when her condition had been deemed unsuitable for proper instruction. The Western Territories represented her last chance at gainful employment, and Kane's words carried the weight of financial ruin. "I assure you, Colonel, every child shall be accounted for at all times." "Excellent." Kane turned to address the formation. "Children, you will show Miss Whitmore the same respect you show me. Her word is law within the schoolhouse. Disobedience will result in consequences you will not enjoy." His gaze swept the ranks. "Dismissed to your studies." As the children filed into the small adobe building that served as their school, Margaret caught sight of something that made her pause. One of the older boys, a sandy-haired youth she remembered as Thomas Garrett, hung back from the others. When he thought no one was looking, he pressed something small into the palm of Mary Fletcher, a scrap of paper, passed so quickly Margaret almost missed it. Inside the schoolhouse, the children arranged themselves on rough wooden benches, facing a slate board mounted on the front wall. Sunlight streamed through 2 narrow windows, illuminating dancing dust motes and the serious faces of her pupils. Margaret took her place behind the simple desk, noting how the children's eyes tracked her every movement. "We shall begin with attendance," she announced, opening her roster. "When I call your name, please respond clearly." She worked down the list methodically, each child answering in turn. Samuel Morrison, present. Mary Fletcher, present. Joseph Running Bear, present. But as she neared the end of the roster, something peculiar caught her attention. Between Timothy Walsh and Victoria Hendricks, there appeared to be an extra line, a space where a name should be, but the ink had somehow faded or been erased, leaving only the faintest impression in the paper. Margaret paused, studying the anomaly. Had there been an error in transcription? She glanced up to find 23 faces watching her expectantly, their expressions carefully neutral. Yet something in their stillness felt wrong, like the moment before a thunderstorm when all the birds stop singing. "Is there?" she began, then stopped herself. Whatever had occurred here before her arrival, it was clear the children were aware of it. Pressing the matter in front of the entire class might violate some unspoken protocol. Instead, she closed the roster and began the day's lessons. But throughout the morning, as she guided them through arithmetic and geography, Margaret found her attention returning to that empty line. During their brief recess, she noticed the children clustering in small groups, their conversations conducted in urgent whispers that ceased whenever she approached. It was young Mary Fletcher who provided the first clue. As the other children worked on their slate exercises, the girl approached Margaret's desk with hesitant steps. Her small hand contained the paper Margaret had seen Thomas pass to her earlier. "Miss Whitmore," Mary whispered, glancing toward the door as if expecting Colonel Kane to materialize. "Thomas wanted me to give you this, but you mustn't let anyone see." Margaret accepted the scrap of paper, noting how Mary's fingers trembled as she released it. Unfolding it carefully beneath her desk, she found a single word written in a child's careful script. "Remember." Before she could ask what it meant, Mary had returned to her bench, head bent studiously over her work. Margaret studied the girl's profile, noting the tension in her small shoulders, the way she kept glancing toward the door. Whatever message Thomas had sent, it carried weight far beyond its simple content. As the afternoon wore on, Margaret began to notice other peculiarities. The children's behavior was almost too perfect. No fidgeting, no whispered conversations, no typical childhood mischief. When she posed questions about their previous studies, their answers came in carefully rehearsed phrases, as if they had been coached on proper responses. Most troubling of all was their reaction to certain subjects. When she mentioned local history or asked about their family's experiences in the territory, a palpable tension filled the room. Eyes darted toward windows, hands clenched in laps, and more than one child shifted uncomfortably in their seat. The final bell of this day brought visible relief to every face. As the children gathered their belongings, Margaret made a decision that would prove fateful. Instead of simply dismissing them, she stepped to the door and addressed them as a group. "Before you leave," she said, keeping her voice gentle but firm, "I want you to know that this classroom is a place where truth is valued above all else. If any of you has concerns or questions about your studies, my door is always open." The children filed past her in silence, but Thomas Garrett lingered until he was the last to leave. Standing just outside the doorway, he turned back to face her, his young face grave with adult worry. "Miss Whitmore," he said quietly, "some truths are dangerous here. Some questions get people sent away." He glanced around the empty parade ground, then back to her. "But if you're brave enough to remember, maybe things can be different this time." Before Margaret could respond, Thomas was gone, jogging across the dusty ground toward the officers' quarters. She stood in the doorway watching him go, his cryptic words echoing in her mind. The scrap of paper in her pocket seemed to burn against her fingers, its single word taking on new and ominous significance. As evening shadows stretched across the fort, Margaret remained at her desk, studying the enrollment roster by lamplight. The empty space between names drew her attention like a wound that refused to heal. She traced the faint impressions left in the paper, trying to make out what name might have been recorded there originally. Gradually, through careful examination and the right angle of light, she began to discern traces of letters. An R, perhaps, followed by what looked like an O and a B. But before she could make out more, the sound of approaching boots on the wooden porch outside made her quickly close the roster and straighten her papers. Colonel Kane appears in the doorway, his tall frame backlit by the last rays of sunset. "Working late, Miss Whitmore?" Admirable dedication. He stepped into the room, his presence seeming to fill the small space. "I trust your first day proceeded smoothly." "Very smoothly, Colonel. The children are remarkably well behaved." Kane's smile held a cold satisfaction. "They understand the importance of proper conduct." Previous teachers sometimes struggled with discipline issues. He moved closer to her desk, his eyes taking in the papers scattered across its surface. "I hope you won't find such struggles necessary." Margaret felt the tremor beginning in her left hand again. She kept it pressed firmly against her thigh, hidden beneath the desk's edge. "I believe mutual respect and clear expectations will serve us well." "Indeed." Kane's gaze lingered on her face, searching for something she couldn't identify. "Tell me, Miss Whitmore, did you notice anything unusual about your enrollment records?" The question hit like a physical blow. Margaret forced herself to meet his eyes steadily, though her heart hammered against her ribs. "Nothing whatsoever, sir. Everything appears to be in perfect order." For a long moment, Kane studied her in silence. Then his smile returned, sharp as a blade. "Excellent. I'm pleased to hear it. Some teachers develop overactive imaginations about their paperwork. They begin to see things that aren't there, or worse, things that should remain unseen." He turned toward the door, then paused. "Have a pleasant evening, Miss Whitmore. Tomorrow promises to be another educational day." After his footsteps faded into the night, Margaret sat in the gathering darkness, her hands shaking openly now. The Colonel's words carried an unmistakable threat, one that went far beyond simple disciplinary concerns. Something had happened to a child, perhaps more than one, and the evidence of it had been carefully erased from official records. She thought of Thomas Garrett's warning, of little Mary Fletcher's frightened eyes, of the unnatural stillness that had pervaded her classroom. Whatever secret the children carried, it was dangerous enough to terrify them into perfect obedience. And now, by accepting this position, Margaret had placed herself squarely in the middle of it. Rising from her desk, she moved to the window overlooking the parade ground. In the distance, lamplight flickered in the officers' quarters where families were settling in for the night. Everything appeared normal, peaceful even, but Margaret had learned long ago that appearances could be the most dangerous deception of all. Her left hand trembled as she reached into her pocket and withdrew Thomas's note. In the lamplight, the single word seemed to pulse with urgent meaning. Remember. But remember what? And more importantly, what terrible price had someone paid for forgetting? As she prepared to lock up the schoolhouse, Margaret made a silent vow. Whatever had happened here before her arrival, whatever dark secret the fort's leadership was hiding, she would uncover the truth. Not because she was particularly brave, but because 23 children were counting on her to keep them safe. And because somewhere in the careful erasures of her enrollment records lay the ghost of a child who deserved to be remembered. The sound of her key turning in the lock echoed across the empty parade ground like a gunshot. Tomorrow would bring new challenges, new tests of her resolve. But tonight, Margaret Whitmore had taken the first step down a path from which there could be no retreat. The second morning at Fort Huachuca began with a public humiliation that would haunt Margaret for weeks to come. Colonel Kane had summoned her to his office before dawn, where she found herself standing at attention before his massive oak desk, like a common soldier awaiting discipline. The pre-dawn chill made her breath visible in small puffs, and her left hand betrayed her nervousness with its familiar tremor. "Miss Whitmore," Kane began without preamble, his voice cutting through the morning silence like a saber through silk. "It has come to my attention that you were observed tampering with official documents yesterday evening." Margaret's blood turned to ice water in her veins. She had been so careful, so certain that her examination of the enrollment roster had gone unnoticed. "Sir, I was merely reviewing my class records to ensure proper preparation for today's lessons." Kane rose from his chair with deliberate slowness, his imposing frame casting long shadows across the Spartanly furnished office. Behind him, a large map of Arizona territory was marked with red pins indicating Apache activity, each one a reminder of the violence that lurked beyond the fort's protective walls. "Sergeant Williams observed lamplight in your classroom well past regulation hours. He also noted your intense interest in certain administrative materials. The trap was closing around her, and Margaret could feel the weight of her precarious position pressing down like a physical force. Without this job, she would have no choice but to return east in disgrace, her teaching career permanently ended. But Kane's next words revealed the true scope of her predicament. Effective immediately, you will be subject to enhanced supervision. Sergeant Williams will conduct unannounced inspections of your classroom and teaching materials. Any deviation from approved curriculum, any unauthorized examination of records, any behavior deemed suspicious will result in immediate termination and forfeiture of wages. Kane's smile held the cruel satisfaction of a predator cornering wounded prey. Furthermore, you will submit daily written reports detailing every aspect of your interactions with the children. Every question asked, every answer given, every moment of your day must be accounted for. Margaret felt her world contracting to the size of Kane's office, the walls seeming to press inward with each word he spoke. The enhanced supervision would make any investigation of the missing child virtually impossible. Yet something in Kane's eagerness to restrict her movements suggested she had already touched upon something significant. I understand completely, Colonel, she managed, proud that her voice remained steady despite the chaos in her mind. Perfect compliance with all regulations. Excellent. Kane returned to his seat, shuffling papers with bureaucratic efficiency. You may go. Classes begin in 1 hour, and I expect your first report on my desk by evening formation. Walking across the parade ground toward the schoolhouse, Margaret noticed how differently the fort appeared in the harsh morning light. What had seemed like a bastion of civilization surrounded by wilderness now felt more like a prison, with Kane as its warden and herself as an unwilling inmate. The children were already gathering outside the school building, their faces carefully composed, but their eyes watchful. As she unlocked the classroom door, Thomas Garrett approached with studied casualness, pretending to examine a pebble while whispering urgently. Miss Whitmore, be careful what you write in those reports. They're not just watching you, they're watching us too. Before she could respond, the boy had melted back into the group, leaving Margaret to wonder how he could possibly know about Kane's surveillance requirements. The answer came during morning attendance, when she noticed that several children bore fresh bruises on their arms and faces. When she inquired about their condition, the responses came in identical phrases that sounded rehearsed. Fell down the steps, miss. Walked into a door, miss. Tripped in the dark, miss. The pattern was too consistent to be coincidental, and Margaret realized with growing horror that the children had been questioned, and perhaps punished, about their interactions with her the previous day. Her attempt to offer them a safe space for truth-telling had instead brought down retribution upon their small heads. The morning's first lesson provided an unexpected opportunity, when Margaret discovered that the approved curriculum included a section on local geography and natural history. She had planned to use this as a pretext for gathering information about the fort's surroundings, but Kane's surveillance made such direct approaches impossible. Instead, she would need to employ more subtle methods. Today we shall study the flora and fauna of the Sonoran Desert, she announced, moving to the slate board where she had prepared detailed drawings of various plant species. Can anyone tell me what they know about the plants that grow near our fort? Samuel Morrison, the captain's son, raised his hand tentatively. The prickly pear cactus blooms yellow in spring, miss. My father says the Apache used to eat the fruit. Excellent observation, Samuel. And where might one find the largest concentrations of prickly pear around Fort Huachuca? The question seemed innocent enough, but Margaret noticed how several children exchanged quick glances before Samuel answered. There's a big patch about a mile southeast of here, near the old wash, but we're not supposed to go there anymore. And why is that? Margaret kept her tone light, academically curious rather than probing. This time the silence stretched uncomfortably long. Finally, little Mary Fletcher spoke up, her voice barely above a whisper. Because that's where the bad things happen. Before Margaret could pursue this revelation, the classroom door burst open and Sergeant Williams strode in, his weathered face set in lines of permanent suspicion. The children snapped to attention with military precision, their previous ease evaporating instantly.
"Miss Whitmore," Williams announced, his voice carrying across the room like a parade ground command. "Colonel Kane requests your immediate presence in his office. The children will remain here under my supervision until your return." Margaret's heart sank as she realized this was exactly the kind of unannounced inspection Kane had threatened. She had no choice but to comply, leaving her students in the hands of a man whose hostile intentions were obvious to everyone present.
Kane's office felt even more oppressive during her second visit of the day. This time, she was not invited to sit, and the colonel remained standing behind his desk like a judge preparing to render sentence. In his hands, he held several sheets of paper covered with neat handwriting. "Miss Whitmore, I have here the preliminary reports from your students regarding yesterday's activities. It seems there were certain irregularities in your teaching methods that require immediate correction."
Margaret's mind raced as she tried to imagine what the children might have been forced to reveal.
Had someone mentioned Thomas's note? Had they described her examination of the enrollment records? The uncertainty was almost worse than knowledge would have been. "Specifically," Kane continued, consulting the papers with theatrical precision, "multiple students report that you encourage them to share personal information about their families and living situations. You also made inquiries about previous teachers and their methods. Such behavior suggests an unhealthy interest in matters beyond your proper sphere of responsibility." The accusations were carefully crafted to sound damning while remaining technically vague. Margaret realized that Kane was building a case for her dismissal, gathering evidence that could be interpreted as professional misconduct. Her only defense lay in finding a way to turn his own regulations against him. "Colonel, if I may," she said, grateful that her voice remained steady despite her racing pulse. "The territorial education standards specifically require teachers to understand their students' backgrounds in order to provide appropriate instruction. My inquiries were conducted in full compliance with those mandates." Kane's eyes narrowed at her response. Clearly, he had expected her to crumble under pressure rather than cite regulatory authority. "Nevertheless, your methods have caused unnecessary distress among the children. Several parents have expressed concerns about your invasive approach to education." This was almost certainly a lie, but Margaret had no way to challenge it directly. Instead, she decided to test the boundaries of Kane's fabrication. "I apologize if my concern for the children's welfare has been misinterpreted. Perhaps you could arrange a meeting with these concerned parents so that I might address their specific worries directly." For a moment, Kane's carefully constructed facade slipped, revealing something like uncertainty beneath. The pause lasted only seconds, but it confirmed Margaret's suspicion that no parents had actually complained. His recovery was swift, but the damage was done.
"That will not be necessary," he said curtly. "Your revised teaching methods will address all concerns adequately. You will confine your instruction to approved curriculum materials only. No personal questions, no historical inquiries, no deviation from established lesson plans whatsoever."
Margaret nodded her compliance, but inwardly she was analyzing the colonel's restrictions for potential loopholes. If she could not ask direct questions, perhaps she could create situations where the children would volunteer information naturally. If she could not deviate from curriculum, she would need to find ways to embed her investigation within approved topics. Returning to the classroom, she found the children sitting in absolute silence under Sergeant Williams's baleful gaze. The man's presence had clearly unnerved them, and several of the younger ones appeared to have been crying. Williams departed without a word, but his message was clear. Any further irregularities would bring swift consequences. The remainder of the morning passed in strained quiet, with Margaret struggling to maintain normal instruction while processing the implications of Kane's threats. It was during the lunch recess that she received an unexpected ally in the form of Mrs. Catherine Morrison, Captain Morrison's wife and mother to Samuel. "Miss Whitmore," the woman approached with obvious nervousness, glancing around to ensure they were not overheard. "Might I have a word with you privately?" They retreated to the empty schoolhouse, where Mrs. Morrison's composed facade finally cracked. She was a handsome woman in her 30s, with the kind of steel-backed posture that came from years of military life, but her hands shook as she spoke. "I wanted to thank you for your kindness to Samuel yesterday. He told me you made the children feel welcome and safe." Her voice dropped to barely above a whisper. "It's been a long time since any teacher showed such care for their well-being."
Margaret sensed an opening, but Kane's warnings echoed in her mind. Still, Mrs. Morrison had approached her,
Which might provide some protection against accusations of improper inquiry. "I'm simply trying to do my job effectively, Mrs. Morrison. Understanding the children helps me teach them better." "Yes, well," the woman struggled with some internal conflict, her eyes darting toward the windows as if expecting surveillance. "Samuel mentioned that you seemed interested in the school's history. There are things that happened before you arrived that still affect the children." This was exactly the information Margaret needed, but she had to be careful not to appear too eager. "I've noticed they seem somewhat reserved. Previous bad experiences with teachers, perhaps?" Mrs. Morrison's laugh held no humor whatsoever. "You could say that. The last teacher, Miss Roberts, she was very dedicated to her students. Too dedicated, according to some." The woman's voice became even quieter. She started asking questions about inconsistencies in the enrollment records, about children who seemed to vanish without explanation.
Margaret's pulse quickened, but she kept her expression neutral. "That does sound concerning. What happened to her?"
Officially, she requested transfer to a post back east. Her replacement position was already arranged before she left. Mrs. Morrison met Margaret's eyes directly. Unofficially, she was escorted off the post by armed guards in the middle of the night. No one was permitted to speak with her before her departure. The parallels to Margaret's own situation were terrifyingly clear. Miss Roberts had noticed the same anomalies, asked the same questions, and paid the ultimate professional price for her curiosity. But something in Mrs. Morrison's manner suggested there was more to the story. "Mrs. Morrison, why are you telling me this? Surely such information could put you at risk as well." The older woman's composure finally broke completely, tears streaming down her cheeks as she spoke. "Because my Samuel came home yesterday excited about school for the first time in months. Because these children deserve better than to live in constant fear, and because—" She paused, struggling with some painful memory. "Because Miss Roberts was my friend, and I failed her when she needed support most." Before Margaret could respond, the sound of approaching footsteps on the wooden porch sent Mrs. Morrison into a panic. She quickly wiped her eyes and straightened her dress, transforming back into the perfect officer's wife with practiced efficiency. "Thank you for your time, Miss Whitmore," she said in a normal voice as Colonel Kane appeared in the doorway. "I'm sure Samuel will continue to thrive under your instruction." Kane's arrival was clearly not coincidental, and his cold smile suggested he had been monitoring their conversation from nearby. "Mrs. Morrison, how thoughtful of you to welcome our new teacher personally. I trust you found Miss Whitmore's methods appropriate." "Completely appropriate, Colonel. She shows genuine care for the children's education." Mrs. Morrison's response was perfectly calibrated, giving Kane no grounds for complaint while subtly defending Margaret's approach. After Mrs. Morrison departed, Kane lingered in the doorway, his presence a silent threat. "I hope you found that conversation enlightening, Miss Whitmore. Mrs. Morrison has been through considerable trauma regarding previous educational staff. I would hate to see her hopes raised only to be disappointed once again." The message was unmistakable. Mrs. Morrison would suffer consequences if Margaret's investigation continued. Kane was using the woman's obvious concern for her son as leverage, turning Margaret's potential ally into another hostage in his campaign of control. As the afternoon classes resumed, Margaret found herself trapped in an impossible situation. Every potential source of information came with attached risks, not just to herself, but to innocent families who had already endured too much. Yet somewhere in the fort's carefully maintained facade lay the truth about what had happened to Miss Roberts and the missing child whose name had been erased from official records. The day's final lesson provided an unexpected breakthrough when Margaret assigned the children a creative writing exercise about their favorite places around the fort. She had chosen this topic carefully, hoping to gather geographical information without appearing to conduct improper inquiries. The results exceeded her expectations. Young Mary Fletcher wrote about the chapel where she liked to pray for all the children who went away. Timothy Walsh described his favorite hiding spot where the grown-ups can't find you if you need to disappear. Most significantly, Joseph Running Bear's essay mentioned the place where the earth remembers what the papers forget. Each piece of writing contained cryptic references that seemed to point toward the same conclusion. The children knew exactly what had happened to their missing classmate, and they had developed their own methods of preserving the memory that adults were trying to erase. As the final bell rang and the children filed out for the day, Thomas Garrett once again lingered behind the others. This time, however, he did not approach Margaret directly. Instead, he deliberately knocked over the wastebasket near her desk, spilling its contents across the floor. As he bent to clean up the mess, he whispered urgently, "Tomorrow is Friday. That's when the bad things usually happen. Watch for the signal. If someone drops their slate during morning lessons, that means danger is coming." Before Margaret could ask what kind of danger, Thomas had finished cleaning and hurried out to join his classmates. She stood alone in the empty classroom, surrounded by the detritus of a normal school day that felt increasingly surreal. Somewhere in the innocent chaos of spilled papers and broken chalk lay the pieces of a puzzle that could cost her everything to solve. That evening, as she prepared her daily report for Colonel Kane, Margaret faced a choice that would define the remainder of her time at Fort Huachuca. She could comply completely with his restrictions, teach only approved lessons, ask no questions, and hope to survive until a transfer opportunity arose. Or she could find ways to continue her investigation while appearing to submit to his authority. The memory of Mrs. Morrison's tears decided the matter. These children and their families had already sacrificed too much to Kane's obsession with control. If Margaret was to have any chance of uncovering the truth, she would need to become far more clever than she had ever been before. Her report to Kane was a masterpiece of misdirection, describing a day of perfectly routine instruction while omitting any mention of the revelations she had uncovered. As she wrote, Margaret began to understand that survival at Fort Huachuca would require her to become something she had never been before. A master of deception, fighting a covert war against an enemy who held all the conventional weapons of power. The tremor in her left hand had finally stilled, replaced by something far more dangerous, a steady determination that burned like a forge fire in her chest. Whatever had happened to Miss Roberts and the vanished child, Margaret would ensure it never happened again, even if it cost her everything she had left to lose. Friday morning arrived with an ominous stillness that seemed to press against the fort's adobe walls like a living thing. Margaret had spent the previous night poring over her students' creative writing assignments, searching for patterns in their cryptic references to disappearances and hidden places. The children's words painted a picture of systematic terror disguised as military discipline, but the full scope of Kane's control remained frustratingly elusive. The morning assembly took place under a sky the color of old brass, with heat mirages already dancing on the horizon despite the early hour. As Margaret watched her students form their usual perfect lines, she noticed an unusual tension in their postures. Several of the older children kept glancing toward the headquarters building, while the younger ones huddled closer together than normal. Colonel Kane emerged from his office with deliberate ceremony, flanked by Sergeant Williams and two other enlisted men Margaret didn't recognize. The additional military presence sent a chill through her despite the mounting desert heat, and she noticed how the children's shoulders drew together like small animals sensing a predator's approach.
Miss Whitmore, Kane's voice carried across the parade ground with unusual formality, today marks an important milestone in our educational program. We will be conducting a special assessment to ensure all students are meeting territorial standards for academic and behavioral compliance.
Margaret felt her stomach clench with foreboding. In her experience, unscheduled assessments rarely served educational purposes. "What form will this assessment take, Colonel?" Kane's smile held the sharp edges of broken glass. Each student will be called individually to demonstrate their knowledge before a review board consisting of myself, Sergeant Williams, and Captain Morrison. We will evaluate not only their academic progress, but their understanding of proper conduct and loyalty to fort regulations. The trap was elegant in its simplicity. By framing the interrogation as an educational assessment, Kane could question each child privately while maintaining the pretense of legitimate oversight. Margaret realized with growing horror that this was how he had likely pressured the children into providing reports about her activities. Any child who failed to give satisfactory answers could be removed from school entirely, effectively silencing potential witnesses.
Sir, if I may suggest conducting these assessments in the classroom where the children might feel more comfortable. That will not be necessary, Kane cut her off with cold finality. The headquarters conference room provides a more appropriate setting for formal evaluation. You will continue with regular instruction for those students not currently being assessed.
As the formation dispersed, Thomas Garrett caught Margaret's eye for just an instant. His hand moved to his slate, fingers poised as if to let it fall, but then he seemed to think better of it. Whatever signal he had planned to give, the circumstances had changed too dramatically for simple warnings. The first victim was little Mary Fletcher. Margaret watched helplessly as the 7-year-old was escorted across the dusty parade ground by Sergeant Williams, her small frame dwarfed by his imposing bulk. The child's terrified backward glance toward the schoolhouse burned itself into Margaret's memory like a brand. Inside the classroom, the remaining students sat in absolute silence, their attention fixed on empty slates they pretended to use for lessons. Margaret attempted to maintain normal instruction, but her voice sounded hollow and artificial even to her own ears. Every few minutes, another child would be summoned, their departure marked by the sound of military boots on wooden steps. It was during Samuel Morrison's turn that Margaret finally understood the true scope of Kane's strategy. The boy had been gone for nearly an hour when Captain Morrison himself appeared at the classroom door, his face gray with suppressed emotion. Behind him came Samuel, walking with the careful gait of someone trying not to cry. "Miss Whitmore," Captain Morrison's voice was tight with barely controlled anger. "I'm afraid Samuel has developed a sudden illness and must return to quarters immediately. He will not be attending classes for the remainder of the week." The boy's eyes met Margaret's for just an instant, and she saw in them a plea for help that she was powerless to answer. Whatever had transpired in that conference room had broken something fundamental in Samuel's spirit, leaving behind only fear and the terrible understanding that even his father's rank could not protect him from Kane's authority. As the morning progressed, a pattern emerged that chilled Margaret to her bones. Children were being returned to the classroom in various states of distress, then quickly removed by their parents under pretenses of illness or family emergencies. By noon, only 12 students remained from her original class of 23. The assault on her remaining students came during the lunch recess. Margaret had noticed Joseph Running Bear sitting alone near the schoolhouse wall, his usual stoic demeanor cracked by whatever pressure had been applied during his assessment. When she approached to offer comfort, she found the boy staring at something carved into the adobe wall that she had never noticed before. There, scratched into the mud brick with what must have been a knife or sharp stone, were a series of small marks. At first glance they appeared to be random scratches, but closer examination revealed a deliberate pattern: names. Dozens of them, carved in letters so small and faded they were nearly invisible unless one knew where to look. "My sister's name is there," Joseph whispered, his finger tracing one of the faint inscriptions. "She was in the school 2 years ago. One day she was here, the next day she was gone. My parents were told she had been sent to relatives in New Mexico for better opportunities." Margaret's blood turned to ice as the implications struck her. This wasn't about a single missing child. It was about a systematic pattern of disappearances spanning years. The enrollment records hadn't been corrected due to clerical error. They had been deliberately altered to hide an ongoing atrocity. "Joseph," she whispered urgently, "how many children have disappeared?" The boy's dark eyes held depths of pain no child should carry. "I don't know exactly, but the wall remembers them all. even when the papers don't. He stood suddenly, his composure cracking entirely. They made me promise not to tell anyone about the names. They said if I talked, my little brother would be sent away too. Before Margaret could respond, Sergeant Williams appeared around the corner of the building, his presence sending Joseph scurrying back toward the other children with obvious terror. The sergeant's eyes swept the area where they had been standing, lingering on the scarred wall with suspicious intensity. "Miss Whitmore," Williams' voice carried a note of barely concealed threat. "Colonel Kane requests your presence in his office immediately. The assessment has revealed certain irregularities that require your immediate attention."
The walk across the parade ground felt like a condemned prisoner's final march. Margaret's mind raced through possible explanations for what Kane might have discovered, but the sight that greeted her in his office exceeded her worst fears. Spread across his desk were the creative writing assignments she had collected the previous day, each one marked with red ink annotations highlighting the very passages she had found most significant. "Miss Whitmore," Kane began without preamble, his voice carrying the cold satisfaction of a prosecutor presenting damning evidence. "It seems your students have been sharing some very interesting stories about their experiences here at Fort Huachuca. Stories that suggest they have been encouraged to discuss matters well beyond the scope of appropriate classroom activities." Margaret forced herself to remain calm despite the hammering of her heart. "Sir, creative writing exercises are specifically included in the territorial curriculum. I was following established educational standards." "Were you indeed?" Kane held up Mary Fletcher's essay, the one that mentioned praying for children who had gone away. "Then perhaps you can explain why multiple students have written about topics that directly contradict official fort records and policies." The trap was closing with inexorable precision, but Margaret realized she had one desperate card left to play. Kane's accusation revealed that he was operating outside proper military channels, conducting interrogations without oversight from higher command. If she could force him to acknowledge this publicly, she might be able to expose his entire operation. "Colonel, these appear to be serious allegations regarding my professional conduct. I believe territorial education law requires that such charges be reviewed by a formal board, including civilian oversight. I would like to request that proper procedures be followed." Kane's mask slipped entirely, revealing the ruthless predator beneath his military facade. "Miss Whitmore, you seem to be under the mistaken impression that civilian oversight applies to military installations in active conflict zones. I am the sole authority for all educational matters within this fort, and my decisions are final and absolute." The admission was exactly what Margaret had hoped to provoke. Kane had just confirmed that he was operating without proper authorization, conducting his reign of terror through intimidation rather than legitimate authority. But even as she recognized this advantage, she understood that knowledge without power to act upon it was merely another form of helplessness. "I understand completely, sir," she said, injecting her voice with the appropriate tone of submission while her mind continued to work furiously. "How would you like me to address these concerns with my students?" Kane's smile returned, sharp as a scalping knife. "You will not be addressing anything with your students, Miss Whitmore. Effective immediately, you are relieved of teaching duties pending a full investigation into your methods and loyalties. Sergeant Williams will escort you to your quarters, where you will remain under guard until transport can be arranged for your departure." The sentence fell like a physical blow, but Margaret had been expecting something like this since the assessments began. What she hadn't anticipated was the sound that suddenly echoed across the fort. The urgent clanging of the emergency bell that signaled Apache raids or other imminent danger. Kane's head snapped toward the window, his attention momentarily diverted from Margaret's disgrace. Through the glass, she could see soldiers running toward defensive positions, while civilians hurried their children toward the safety of interior buildings. But there was something wrong with the response pattern, something that didn't match the organized chaos of a genuine alert. "Sir," Sergeant Williams burst through the office door without ceremony, "we have a situation. The bell rope has been cut, and several of the children from the school are missing from their quarters." Margaret's heart leapt with sudden understanding. This was no Apache raid. It was a carefully orchestrated diversion created by her students. While Kane had been interrogating them and threatening their families, the children had been planning their own form of resistance.
Kane's face contorted with rage as the implication struck him. Find them! Search every building, every hiding place, and double the guard on Miss Whitmore. If she has encouraged this insubordination, she'll answer for it personally.
As Williams rushed to implement the search, Margaret allowed herself a moment of fierce pride in her students' courage.
They had recognized that conventional adult authority offered no protection, so they had taken matters into their own small hands. Whatever they were planning, it demonstrated a level of organization and determination that spoke volumes about the true nature of life at Fort Huachuca. The remainder of the afternoon passed in a blur of shouted orders, running soldiers, and frantic searches. Margaret was confined to Kane's office under armed guard, but the activity visible through the windows told its own story. The missing children had vanished as completely as their disappeared predecessors, but this time it was by their own choice rather than Kane's design. As evening shadows lengthened across the parade ground, Kane returned to his office with barely controlled fury etched across his features. His uniform was dusty from participating personally in the search, and his usual composed facade had crumbled entirely.
"They're gone," he snarled, collapsing into his chair with obvious exhaustion. 11 children vanished without a trace. No tracks, no witnesses, nothing. His eyes fixed on Margaret with naked hatred. "This is your doing, you interfering Eastern witch. You've poisoned their minds against proper authority." Margaret met his gaze steadily, feeling a strange sense of calm despite her desperate circumstances.
"Colonel, if children prefer to face the dangers of the desert rather than remain under your protection, perhaps that says more about your methods than mine." Kane's hand moved to his service revolver, and for a moment Margaret thought he might actually shoot her where she sat. Instead, he seemed to master himself with visible effort, his breathing gradually returning to normal.
"You have no idea what you've unleashed," he said finally, his voice heavy with something that might have been genuine regret. "Those children think they're being brave, but they'll be dead by morning. Apache bands, wild animals, exposure. The desert doesn't care about their noble intentions."
For the first time since meeting Kane, Margaret heard something approaching honest emotion in his voice. Behind the cruelty and authoritarian control lay what might once have been genuine concern for the children's welfare. But whatever good intentions had originally motivated him had been twisted into something monstrous by years of unchecked power. "Then help me bring them back safely," she said quietly. "Call off your investigation, promise them protection, and they'll return willingly." Kane's laugh held no humor whatsoever. "Protection? Miss Whitmore, there is no protection out here except absolute obedience to military authority. These children have chosen chaos over order, sentiment over survival. Their fate is sealed by their own foolish choices." As night fell over Fort Huachuca, Margaret found herself locked in her assigned quarters with a guard posted outside her door. Through her small window, she could see search parties departing the fort with torches and lanterns, their lights disappearing into the vast darkness of the surrounding desert.
Somewhere in that hostile wilderness, 11 children were making a desperate gamble with their lives
Rather than submit to Kane's version of safety. Margaret had no way of knowing whether they would survive until dawn, but their courage had accomplished something her careful investigation could not. It had forced Kane to reveal the true nature of his authority and the price of resistance. The tremor in her left hand had returned with devastating intensity, but this time it felt less like weakness than like barely contained energy seeking release. Tomorrow would bring either tragedy or triumph, but tonight Margaret Whitmore had learned that sometimes the only way to fight overwhelming power was to refuse to be defeated by it. Outside her window, the desert held its breath, waiting to see whether courage or fear would write the final chapter of her student's story. Dawn broke over Fort Huachuca with the pale light of Judgment Day, casting long shadows across the parade ground where search parties had assembled throughout the night. Margaret pressed her face to the small window of her quarters, watching through the iron bars as soldiers prepared for what Colonel Kane had grimly announced would be a recovery mission rather than a rescue operation. The 11 missing children had been in the desert for nearly 18 hours, and Kane's predictions about their survival prospects grew more dire with each passing minute. The sound of her door being unlocked came with military precision, followed by Sergeant Williams's gruff command to dress quickly and report to the colonel's office. Margaret's guard during the night had been a young corporal who seemed almost apologetic about his duty, but Williams carried the harsh authority of a man following orders he thoroughly endorsed.
"Move along, miss," Williams growled as he escorted her across the dusty ground. "Colonel's got something special planned for you this morning."
Kane's office had been transformed into a military command post, with maps spread across every available surface and officers clustered around discussing search patterns and tactical approaches. The colonel himself stood at the center of it all like a general preparing for battle, his bearing erect despite the obvious strain of the sleepless night. "Miss Whitmore," Kane's voice cut through the military chatter like a blade through silk, "I trust you slept well while those children you inspired faced their first night alone in hostile territory." The accusation hit like a physical blow, but Margaret forced herself to meet his gaze without flinching. Around the room, other officers watched the confrontation with obvious interest, and she realized that Kane was staging this encounter for maximum dramatic effect.
"Sir, my only inspiration to those children was the belief that education should serve truth rather than fear." Kane's smile held the cold satisfaction of a prosecutor presenting his closing argument.
"Truth, Miss Whitmore? Then let me share some truths with you." He gestured toward the largest map, where red circles marked the locations of previous Apache attacks. In the past 2 years, 17 civilians have been killed within 10 miles of this fort. 5 of them were children who wandered beyond our protective perimeter. The statistics struck the assembled officers like physical blows, and Margaret saw several men exchange meaningful glances. Whatever Kane's other failings, his warnings about desert dangers were apparently well-founded in brutal experience. "Furthermore," Kane continued, warming to his theme, "we have confirmed Apache sign less than 5 miles from the fort as of yesterday evening. A war party of at least 20 braves moving in this direction with clear, hostile intent." He turned to face Margaret directly. "Your 11 students are now somewhere in territory controlled by warriors who consider white children valuable commodities for ransom or revenge." The room fell silent except for the scratch of boot leather on wooden floors as officers shifted uncomfortably. Margaret felt the weight of their judgment pressing down upon her like a physical force, but something in Kane's presentation struck her as too convenient, too perfectly crafted to support his narrative. "Colonel," she said carefully, "if Apache warriors are indeed active in the area, shouldn't our primary concern be organizing proper rescue efforts rather than assigning blame?" Kane's eyes narrowed at her response, and Margaret realized she had touched upon something he preferred not to address directly. "Miss Whitmore, I have already dispatched every available patrol to search for those children. But given the tactical situation, my primary responsibility must be the safety of the entire fort community, rather than risking additional lives for 11 individuals who chose to place themselves in danger." The admission revealed the harsh calculus of frontier military life, but it also exposed a crucial weakness in Kane's position. If he was truly concerned about Apache threats, why had he devoted so much energy to interrogating school children rather than focusing on legitimate defensive preparations? Before Margaret could pursue this line of reasoning, a commotion outside the office interrupted the tense confrontation. Through the windows, she could see a rider approaching at full gallop, his horse lathered with sweat and his posture suggesting urgent news. The messenger proved to be Private Henderson, one of the youngest soldiers assigned to the fort. He burst through the office door without ceremony, his face flushed with excitement and exhaustion. "Colonel Kane, sir," Henderson gasped, struggling to catch his breath after his hard ride. "We found them, sir!" "The missing children, they're alive and safe." The announcement hit the room like a thunderclap, and Margaret felt her knees nearly buckle with relief. Whatever ordeal her students had endured, they had survived their desperate gamble with the desert.
"Where?" Kane's voice was sharp with what might have been either relief or disappointment. How many? What's their condition?
Henderson straightened to deliver his report with military precision. All 11 children, sir, found at the old Butterfield station about 8 miles southeast. They're in good health, well fed and hydrated. No injuries except minor cuts and bruises.
Margaret's relief was immediately tempered by curiosity about how 11 children could have survived a night in the desert so successfully. The Butterfield station had been abandoned for years, offering little in the way of shelter or supplies. Kane seemed to share her puzzlement.
Private. That station has been deserted since 1871. How did those children manage to find adequate shelter and provisions? Henderson's expression grew troubled, and he glanced around the room as if seeking guidance from his superior officers. Sir, that's the strange part. They weren't alone out there. The children report being cared for by... Well, sir, they claim they were helped by other children who shouldn't have been there.
The silence that followed Henderson's words was profound and ominous. Margaret watched Kane's face cycle through a series of expressions: confusion, recognition, and finally a kind of terrible understanding that drained the color from his weathered features. What children? Kane's voice had dropped to barely above a whisper. Describe them exactly. Henderson consulted a small notebook, his hands trembling slightly as he read. The missing students described at least 6 other children, ranging in age from maybe 8 to 14 years old. They knew details about the fort, about specific families and incidents. But, sir, he paused, clearly struggling with what he had to report. According to our records, all of these children have been transferred to other posts or returned to relatives over the past 2 years.
Margaret felt the world shift beneath her feet as the implications struck home. The disappeared children, the ones whose names had been erased from enrollment records, were not dead or relocated as Kane had claimed. They were alive, hidden somewhere in the desert, surviving through their own resourcefulness and mutual support. Kane's reaction confirmed her worst suspicions. Instead of relief at this miraculous news, the colonel appeared to be calculating damage control measures. His eyes swept the room, taking inventory of who had heard Henderson's report and how much they understood about its significance. Private Henderson, Kane said with forced calm, you will report to Sergeant Williams for immediate reassignment to perimeter patrol duty. You are not to discuss this matter with anyone until a full investigation can be completed. The dismissal was clearly intended to limit the spread of information, but Margaret realized that Kane's attempt at containment was already too late. Too many officers had heard too much, and the implications were too significant to be buried through simple military discipline. Captain Morrison, who had remained silent throughout the morning's proceedings, finally spoke up with the authority of his rank and obvious concern for his son's welfare. Colonel, with respect, if there are children living unsupervised in the desert, shouldn't our immediate priority be bringing them back to safety? Kane's response revealed the true scope of his desperation. Captain, those children made their choice to abandon the protection and authority of this fort. They are no longer our responsibility, and any attempt to retrieve them would require resources we cannot spare given current Apache activity. The callousness of this statement struck the assembled officers like a physical blow. Several men exchanged glances that spoke volumes about their assessment of Kane's leadership and priorities. Margaret realized that the colonel's authority was cracking under the weight of his own contradictions. Sir, she said quietly, knowing that her words would carry to every officer in the room, if children prefer the dangers of the desert to the safety of your protection, perhaps that raises questions about the nature of that protection. Kane's hand moved instinctively toward his sidearm, but the presence of his subordinates prevented any overtly violent response. Instead, he seemed to gather himself for one final attempt at maintaining control over the deteriorating situation. Miss Whitmore, you are responsible for this catastrophe through your interference with proper discipline and military authority. Effective immediately, you will be placed under arrest, pending charges of inciting mutiny and endangering military personnel. The accusations were serious enough to warrant court-martial proceedings, but Margaret realized that Kane was overplaying his hand. By escalating to formal charges, he would be required to provide evidence and testimony that might expose far more than he intended. Before anyone could respond to Kane's pronouncement, another interruption shattered the tension in the room. This time, it was Mrs. Morrison who appeared in the doorway, flanked by several other officers' wives and accompanied by what appeared to be a civilian official Margaret didn't recognize. "Colonel Kane," Mrs. Morrison announced with the quiet authority of a woman who had finally reached the limits of her patience. "I believe you should meet Territorial, Inspector Williams from the Bureau of Indian Affairs. He's here to investigate reports of irregularities in the administration of educational and child welfare programs at this fort." The inspector proved to be a slight man in his 50s, with the kind of sharp eyes and careful manner that suggested extensive experience in bureaucratic investigations. His presence transformed the dynamics in the room instantly, as Kane realized that his isolated command was no longer beyond the reach of outside oversight. "Colonel Kane," Inspector Williams said with bureaucratic precision, "I have received multiple reports suggesting that children assigned to your educational programs have been subjected to improper discipline and, in some cases, have disappeared entirely from official records. I'm here to conduct a formal investigation into these allegations."
Margaret watched Kane's carefully constructed world collapse in real time. The inspector's arrival meant that higher authorities were already aware of problems at Fort Huachuca, and Kane's attempts to suppress information had been insufficient to prevent outside intervention.
"Inspector Williams," Kane said with forced composure, "I'm afraid you've been misinformed about conditions at this fort. Our educational programs meet all territorial standards, and any irregularities in records are simply the result of routine transfers and family relocations."
The inspector's smile suggested he had encountered such denials many times before.
"Colonel, I have detailed statements from multiple families describing children who were supposedly transferred to other posts but never arrived at their reported destinations. I also have testimony from former teachers describing systematic intimidation and records falsification." Margaret realized that Miss Roberts, her predecessor, had not disappeared as completely as Kane had intended. Somewhere, somehow, the woman had managed to provide testimony that had triggered this investigation. The colonel's reign of terror was finally facing accountability from legitimate authority. The confrontation that followed was swift and decisive. Inspector Williams presented documentation that revealed the scope of Kane's unauthorized activities, while the assembled officers gradually realized that they had been complicit in a systematic abuse of power that extended far beyond proper military discipline. As Kane was formally relieved of command pending the investigation's completion, Margaret found herself facing a choice that would define the remainder of her time in Arizona Territory. She could accept vindication and return to a normal teaching position, or she could commit herself to the more difficult task of helping to heal the damage that had been done to her students and their families. The decision came when little Mary Fletcher appeared in the doorway, having been brought back with the other rescued children. The girl's eyes sought Margaret's across the crowded room, and in them Margaret saw not just relief, but a desperate need for adult guidance that wasn't tainted by fear and control.
"Inspector Williams," Margaret said clearly, ensuring that her voice carried to everyone present, "I request permission to continue teaching these children while your investigation proceeds. They've been through enough disruption, and they deserve educational stability during this transition." The inspector's approval came with conditions and oversight, but it represented something Margaret had begun to think impossible: a chance to provide her students with the safety and respect they had been denied for so long. As the morning's drama concluded and the various officials departed to begin their formal procedures, Margaret found herself alone in the schoolhouse with her 11 returned students. They sat quietly at their desks, but their posture was different now, less rigid, more naturally childlike. "Miss Whitmore," Thomas Garrett said quietly, speaking for the group as he had so many times before, "we found them, all the children who were supposed to be gone. They're alive, and they've been taking care of each other. They want to come home, but they're scared of what might happen." Margaret looked at the faces before her and saw not just her current students, but the ghosts of all the children whose names had been erased from official records. The work ahead would be difficult and complex, but for the first time since arriving at Fort Huachuca, she felt that truth and justice were possible.
The desert had rendered its judgment on Colonel Kane's version of order, and it had been found wanting. Now it was time to build something better from the wreckage of his authoritarian control. The autumn sun cast long shadows across the parade ground of Fort Huachuca as Margaret prepared for what would prove to be the most challenging day of her teaching career. 3 weeks had passed since Inspector Williams's arrival and Colonel Kane's removal from command, but the psychological wounds left by years of systematic abuse would require far more time to heal than bureaucratic investigations to complete. Under the temporary command of Major Davidson, the fort had begun the delicate process of reuniting families with children who had been living as fugitives in the desert. The old Butterfield station had yielded 17 survivors, not just the 11 who had fled during Kane's final assessment, but 6 others who had been presumed transferred or relocated over the previous 2 years. Their stories painted a picture of resourcefulness and mutual support that both inspired and horrified the adults charged with their care. Margaret stood before her expanded classroom, now housing 28 students whose ages range from 6 to 15. The older children had assumed protective roles over the younger ones during their time in exile, creating family structures that transcended blood relationships and military hierarchies. Reintegrating them into conventional educational frameworks while respecting the bonds they had forged would require every ounce of wisdom and patience she possessed.
"Good morning, children," Margaret began, noting how naturally the returned exiles had integrated with those who had never fled. "Today we're going to discuss something that affects all of us, how we build communities that protect and nurture everyone within them."
The lesson had been approved by Inspector Williams as part of a therapeutic approach to education, designed to help the children process their traumatic experiences while developing healthier models of social organization. But Margaret knew that the real work would happen in the spaces between official curriculum, in the moments when trust could be rebuilt and truth could finally be spoken freely. Samuel Morrison raised his hand tentatively, his confidence still fragile after his ordeal during Kane's assessments. "Miss Whitmore, when we were in the desert, we had rules too. But they were different rules, ones that kept us safe instead of making us afraid."
Margaret nodded encouragingly, recognizing this as exactly the kind of discussion that needed to happen. "Can you tell us about those rules, Samuel?"
The boy glanced around at his classmates, seeking permission from the informal leaders among the returned exiles. Joseph Running Bear, now acknowledged as something of an elder statesman despite his 10 years, gave a slight nod of approval. "We promise to always tell the truth to each other," Samuel continued, his voice growing stronger, "and we promise that no one would be punished for asking questions or making mistakes. And most important, we promise that no one would ever be abandoned, no matter what." Margaret felt tears prick her eyes at the simple wisdom contained in those childhood vows. In their desperation, these young people had instinctively created the kind of community that the adults around them had failed to provide, one based on mutual support rather than authoritarian control. "Those sound like excellent rules," she said carefully. "How do you think we might adapt them for our classroom here at the fort?" The discussion that followed was unlike anything Margaret had experienced in her years as an educator. The children spoke with a maturity born of genuine hardship, but also with a hope that had been nearly destroyed by Kane's regime. They talked about the importance of having adults who listened rather than commanded, who protected rather than threatened, who saw education as a tool for empowerment rather than control.
Mary Fletcher, now 8 years old but carrying herself with the gravity of someone much older, raised a question that cut to the heart of their collective trauma. "Miss Whitmore, why did the grown-ups lie to our families about where we went? Why did they make everyone think we were dead or sent away?" The question hung in the air like smoke from a signal fire, demanding an honest response that would acknowledge the reality of institutional betrayal without destroying what remained of the children's faith in adult authority. Margaret chose her words with extreme care. "Mary, sometimes adults make very bad decisions when they're more worried about maintaining control than about doing what's right. Colonel Kane believed that fear was the best way to keep people safe, but fear actually made everyone less safe, especially you children.
Thomas Garrett, who had emerged as one of the natural leaders among the survivors, spoke up with quiet intensity. Miss Whitmore, we kept records too. While we were in the desert, we wrote down everything we remembered about what happened here. All the children who disappeared before us, all the punishments that weren't fair, all the times adults lied to families.
Margaret felt her pulse quicken with both excitement and concern. If the children had indeed maintained their own documentation of Kane's abuses, it could provide crucial evidence for Inspector Williams's investigation. But it also meant that these young people had been carrying an enormous burden of responsibility for preserving truth in the face of systematic deception.
Those records could be very important, Thomas. Have you shared them with Inspector Williams?
The boy's expression grew troubled, and Margaret noticed how several of the other returned children shifted uncomfortably in their seats. Clearly, there were complications she hadn't anticipated. "We want to," Thomas said carefully, "but we're scared about what might happen to some of the grown-ups who helped us. There were people at the fort who knew what was happening but couldn't stop it. They tried to help in small ways, and we don't want them to get in trouble for not doing more." Margaret began to understand the ethical complexity that these children had been grappling with during their exile. They had witnessed not just Kane's cruelty, but also the painful compromises made by adults who lacked the power or courage to resist his authority directly. Their desire to protect these flawed allies demonstrated a level of moral sophistication that many adults never achieved. "That's a very grown-up concern, Thomas. Perhaps we could work together to find ways to share your information that focus on stopping bad behavior without punishing people who were trying to do their best in difficult circumstances." The suggestion seemed to ease some of the tension in the room, and Margaret made a mental note to discuss this issue with Inspector Williams privately. The investigation needed the children's testimony, but it also needed to be conducted in ways that honored their complex understanding of the moral landscape they had navigated. As the morning progressed, Margaret found herself repeatedly impressed by the resilience and wisdom her students had developed during their ordeal. But she also noticed signs of trauma that would require professional attention: nightmares and startled responses among the younger children, hypervigilance, and protective instincts among the older ones that sometimes manifested as aggressive behavior toward perceived threats. The most challenging case proved to be Rebecca Martinez, a 12-year-old whose family had been told she had been sent to relatives in California. Rebecca had been among the first to flee Kane's regime, and her time in the desert had left her with a deep mistrust of all adult authority, including Margaret's attempts to provide safety and structure. During the lunch recess, Rebecca approached Margaret's desk with the wary caution of a wild animal testing the intentions of a potential predator. "Miss Whitmore," she said quietly, "the other kids say you're different from the teachers who were here before. But how do we know you won't change when things get difficult?" The question struck to the heart of Margaret's own uncertainties about her role in this traumatized community. She had no guarantees to offer, no promises that wouldn't sound hollow in light of the betrayals these children had already experienced. "Rebecca, I can't promise that I'll never make mistakes or that difficult situations won't test all of us, but I can promise that I'll never deliberately hurt you or lie to you, and that if I do make mistakes, I'll listen when you tell me about them and try to do better." Rebecca studied Margaret's face with the intensity of someone who had learned to read adult expressions for signs of deception or danger. Whatever she saw there seemed to satisfy some internal test, because her posture relaxed slightly. "The other kids have been talking about whether we should show you the place where we hid our records. It's not just papers. We carved some things into rocks, and we buried other things in places where only we know how to find them." Rebecca paused, weighing her next words carefully. "If we show you, will you promise that you won't tell the grown-ups where to find everything unless we say it's okay?"
Margaret recognized this as a crucial moment in building trust with these traumatized children. They were offering to share their most precious secrets, the evidence that could ensure justice for their suffering, but only if she agreed to let them maintain control over how that information was used.
Rebecca, I promise that I won't reveal any locations or details without your permission and the permission of the other children who helped create those records. You've been protecting each other and preserving the truth for a long time. You should have the final say about how that truth is shared. The girl's smile was the first genuinely relaxed expression Margaret had seen from any of the returned exiles. It was a reminder that beneath their premature wisdom and hard-earned survival skills, these were still children who needed to feel some measure of agency and control over their own stories. That afternoon brought an unexpected development when Inspector Williams requested a private meeting with Margaret in the temporary headquarters that had been established following Kane's removal. The inspector's expression was grave, and Margaret sensed that significant developments had occurred behind the scenes.
Miss Whitmore, Williams began without preamble, I've received word from Territorial Headquarters regarding Colonel Kane's case. The evidence we've gathered here has prompted investigations at 3 other military installations where Kane previously served. It appears that his methods were not unique to Fort Huachuca.
Margaret felt her stomach clench with the implications. If Kane had been systematically abusing his authority at multiple posts over a period of years, how many other children had suffered under his version of military discipline? Furthermore, Williams continued, we've discovered that Kane's superiors were aware of complaints about his methods but chose to transfer him, rather than address the underlying problems. There will be significant ramifications throughout the territorial military command structure.
The inspector's next words carried even more troubling implications. Miss Whitmore, I need you to understand that there may be attempts to minimize or suppress some aspects of this investigation. There are powerful interests that would prefer to treat this as an isolated incident rather than acknowledge systematic failures in military oversight.
Margaret felt a familiar chill as she recognized the potential for institutional cover-up that could deny justice to her students and their families. Inspector Williams, what can I do to ensure that the children's experiences are properly documented and acknowledged?
Williams leaned forward in his chair, his expression intense with bureaucratic urgency. Continue building trust with those children, Miss Whitmore. Their testimony is crucial, but it needs to be given freely rather than extracted through pressure. The records they kept during their exile could be the key to ensuring that this kind of abuse never happens again.
As Margaret prepared to leave the meeting, Williams added one final piece of information that would prove crucial to everything that followed. Miss Whitmore, there's something else you should know. Your predecessor, Miss Roberts, didn't just disappear as Kane claimed. She's alive, and she's been working with territorial authorities to build the case against Kane from the outside. She specifically requested that I tell you how proud she is of what you've accomplished here. The revelation that Miss Roberts was not only alive, but actively working for justice provided Margaret with a sense of connection to something larger than her individual efforts. She was part of a chain of educators and advocates who refused to accept that children should suffer in silence for the convenience of adult authority. Walking back to the schoolhouse in the gathering dusk, Margaret reflected on how much had changed since her first terrifying morning at Fort Huachuca. The tremor in her left hand, which had once been a source of shame and vulnerability, now felt like a barometer of her emotional investment in her students' welfare. When injustice made her angry, when children trusted her with their secrets, when small acts of courage demanded recognition, her hand trembled, and she had learned to see it as a sign of engagement rather than weakness. The final challenge of the day came when she discovered that someone had left a package on her desk. A cloth bundle tied with string and accompanied by a note written in multiple hands. The note read simply, "For Miss Whitmore, who remembered when everyone else forgot." Inside the bundle, Margaret found artifacts from the children's time in exile that took her breath away. Carved wooden figures representing each child who had fled the fort. A carefully folded map showing safe routes through the desert. And most significantly, a leather journal filled with pages of testimony written in the careful script of children determined to preserve truth despite overwhelming pressure to forget. The journal contained not just accounts of Kane's abuses, but also stories of small acts of kindness from adults who had tried to help within the constraints of military hierarchy. Cooks who had smuggled extra food to hungry children. medical personnel who had treated injuries without asking too many questions about their causes. Even some soldiers who had deliberately failed to notice when children needed moments of freedom from oppressive supervision. As Margaret read these accounts by lamplight, she understood that her students had created something far more valuable than simple documentation of abuse. They had preserved a nuanced understanding of moral complexity that recognized the difference between those who actively perpetrated harm and those who passively perpetrated harm who struggled to do good within an unjust system. The journal's final entry was written in Thomas Garrett's careful hand. We give this to Miss Whitmore because she showed us that grown-ups can change, and that truth doesn't have to be dangerous if the right people are listening. We hope that other children who are scared will read this someday and know that they don't have to be quiet about bad things that happen to them.
Margaret closed the journal with tears streaming down her face, understanding that she held in her hands not just evidence for Inspector Williams's investigation, but a testament to the resilience and wisdom of young people who had refused to let injustice have the final word in their story.
Tomorrow would bring new challenges as the formal proceedings against Cain moved forward and the work of healing continued. But tonight, Margaret Whitmore sat in her small quarters reading the most important lesson plan she had ever encountered, one written by her students about courage, justice, and the power of refusing to forget.
The desert wind whispered against her windows, carrying with it the promise that truth, once properly tended, could take root even in the most hostile ground. Spring arrived at Fort Huachuca with unusual gentleness, as if the desert itself recognized the fragile healing taking place within the adobe walls of the military outpost. Margaret stood before her classroom window, watching her students tend the small garden they had planted in what had once been the punishment yard where Colonel Cain had conducted his harsh disciplinary proceedings. The transformation felt symbolic of larger changes that had reshaped not just the fort, but the entire approach to military education throughout Arizona Territory. 6 months had passed since Inspector Williams had completed his investigation and submitted his final report to Territorial Headquarters. Cain's court-martial had resulted in dismissal from service and criminal charges that would likely see him imprisoned for the remainder of his natural life. But more significantly, his case had prompted sweeping reforms in how military installations manage civilian populations, particularly children and educational programs. Margaret's role had evolved far beyond that of a simple schoolteacher. She now served as the territorial coordinator for educational standards at military posts, working with other survivors of Cain's system to develop policies that prioritize child welfare over administrative convenience. Her left hand still trembled during moments of high emotion, but she had learned to see it as a compass pointing toward injustice that still needed to be addressed. The morning assembly had taken on an entirely different character under Major Davidson's permanent command. Instead of rigid formations and public intimidation, children now gathered in informal groups, while adults provided gentle guidance and genuine safety. The enrollment records, once tools of deception and control, had been meticulously reconstructed to honor every child who had been erased from official memory. Miss Whitmore, Mary Fletcher approached with the confident bearing of a 9-year-old who had learned that her voice mattered to the adults around her. "We finished the memorial garden yesterday. Would you like to see it before classes begin?" The memorial garden represented one of the most powerful healing initiatives undertaken by the fort community. Using the detailed records the children had maintained during their exile, families had worked together to create a living tribute to every child who had suffered under Cain's regime. Each plant, each stone, each carefully crafted element told a story of survival and remembrance. Margaret followed Mary through the courtyard to a space that had once housed Cain's interrogation rooms. The transformation was breathtaking. Native desert plants created natural borders around carefully tended plots where flowers and vegetables grew in abundance. At the center stood a fountain carved from local stone, its gentle water music providing a sense of peace that had been absent from the fort for years. But the most moving element was a series of small plaques embedded in the garden's walking paths.
Each plaque bore the name of a child who had been disappeared from official records, along with a brief tribute written by their classmates. The plaques served not only as memorials, but as promises that such erasures would never be permitted again.
This one is for Roberto Vasquez, Mary said, kneeling beside one of the markers. He was in my class 2 years ago before you came. He asked too many questions about why some of the Apache children were treated differently, so Colonel Kane sent him away. But we found him during the desert time, and now he's back home with his family in Tucson.
Margaret knelt beside Mary, reading the tribute that had been crafted with obvious care.
Roberto taught us that questions are not dangerous, only the people who fear them are dangerous. The simple words carried a wisdom that many adults spent lifetimes learning to understand. As they walked through the garden, Margaret was struck by how the children had used this space to process not just their trauma, but their understanding of justice and healing. The plaques didn't focus on punishment or revenge against those who had wronged them. Instead, they celebrated qualities like courage, truth-telling, and mutual support that had enabled survival during the darkest times. Miss Whitmore, Thomas Garrett appeared at her elbow with his characteristic quiet intensity. Inspector Williams is here for his monthly visit. He wants to talk with you about the new schools they're planning to build.
Margaret nodded, feeling a familiar mixture of excitement and trepidation. The territorial government had allocated unprecedented funding for educational infrastructure at military posts, partly as a response to the scandals uncovered by Williams's investigation. But building new facilities was only the beginning of creating genuinely safe learning environments.
Williams was waiting in the administrative office that had once been Kane's seat of power. The inspector had aged visibly during the months of investigation and reform, but his manner carried a satisfaction that spoke to meaningful accomplishment rather than bureaucratic success. Miss Whitmore, Williams began with genuine warmth, I have remarkable news. The territorial legislature has approved funding for 5 new educational facilities at military installations, each designed according to the principles you've helped develop here. More importantly, they've established oversight mechanisms to ensure that what happened under Kane's command can never occur again. The news represented vindication for everything Margaret and her students had endured, but she had learned to be cautious about celebrating bureaucratic victories before seeing their practical implementation. Inspector Williams, what safeguards have been established to ensure that these oversight mechanisms aren't simply bypassed by commanders who prefer the old methods? Williams smiled at her skepticism, recognizing the hard-won wisdom behind her question. Each facility will have civilian educational coordinators with direct reporting lines to territorial headquarters, bypassing military command entirely for matters related to child welfare. Additionally, student representatives will serve on oversight committees with real authority to raise concerns about adult behavior. The concept of giving children formal roles in monitoring adult conduct was revolutionary, and Margaret felt a surge of pride at how far the conversation had progressed from Kane's authoritarian model.
Furthermore, Williams continued, your former students have been invited to serve as consultants in designing the new facilities. Their insights about creating genuinely safe educational environments have proven invaluable to our planning process. Margaret thought about the wisdom her students had demonstrated throughout their ordeal. Their ability to distinguish between legitimate authority and authoritarian control, their understanding of how institutions could be reformed rather than simply replaced, their commitment to protecting future children from the trauma they had experienced.
Inspector Williams, I'd like to propose something additional. Rather than simply consulting with my former students, I think we should create ongoing roles for young people who have survived institutional abuse. They could serve as advocates for current students, helping to identify problems before they escalate to crisis levels.
The inspector's expression grew thoughtful as he considered the implications of Margaret's suggestion.
You're proposing to institutionalize the kind of peer protection networks that your students created naturally during their time in the desert. Exactly. They proved that children are capable of sophisticated moral reasoning and mutual support when given the opportunity. Instead of treating those capabilities as emergency responses to adult failure, we should build them into our normal educational structures. Their conversation was interrupted by a knock on the office door. Samuel Morrison entered with the confident bearing of a young person who had learned that his opinions were valued by the adults around him. "Miss Whitmore, excuse me for interrupting, but we've been discussing something important in class and we'd like your guidance." Samuel paused, gathering his thoughts with obvious care. "We've been reading about other places where children have been treated badly by grown-ups in authority. Schools and orphanages and other places where adults were supposed to protect kids but didn't."
Margaret felt her pulse quicken with both pride and concern. Her students had clearly been expanding their understanding of institutional abuse beyond their own experiences, which demonstrated remarkable intellectual growth, but also suggested they were grappling with disturbing realities about the wider world.
"What kind of guidance are you seeking, Samuel?" The boy's expression grew intense with the moral seriousness that had become characteristic of the fort's children since their ordeal. "We want to know if there are ways we can help children in other places who might be going through what we went through. We have knowledge now about how to survive and how to fight back, and we think maybe we should share it." Margaret exchanged glances with Inspector Williams, recognizing that her students were proposing to transform their traumatic experiences into tools for helping others. The idea was both inspiring and potentially dangerous, as it could expose them to additional trauma while placing enormous responsibility on young shoulders. "Samuel, that's a very generous and brave idea, but helping other children in crisis requires careful planning and adult support. It's not something you should take on by yourselves."
Williams leaned forward in his chair, his bureaucratic mind clearly working through the implications of the boy's proposal.
"Samuel, what if we created formal programs where young people who have survived institutional abuse could work with trained adults to provide support and advocacy for children in similar situations? You could share your knowledge while having proper supervision and emotional support." Samuel's face lit up with excitement at the inspector's suggestion. "That would be perfect. We could teach other kids about keeping records and staying together and not believing grown-ups who say that bad treatment is for their own good." As Samuel hurried back to share this news with his classmates, Margaret reflected on how profoundly her students had been changed by their experiences. They had developed not just survival skills, but a sense of social responsibility that many adults never achieved. Their desire to help others demonstrated that trauma, when properly processed and supported, could become a source of strength rather than permanent damage. The remainder of the day brought a series of small moments that illustrated how completely the culture of Fort Huachuca had been transformed. During arithmetic lessons, children felt free to ask questions without fear of being labeled insubordinate. During recess, adults provided guidance without resorting to threats or intimidation. During the evening meal, families gathered in the mess hall with genuine relaxation rather than the tense vigilance that had characterized Kane's regime. But the most significant change was visible in the way children interacted with authority figures. They had learned to distinguish between adults who deserved respect and those who demanded submission. They offered cooperation to those who had earned trust, while maintaining healthy skepticism toward those who hadn't proven themselves worthy of confidence. As Margaret prepared for sleep in her quarters, she reflected on a letter she had received that afternoon from Miss Roberts, her predecessor who had initiated the investigation that eventually brought down Kane's system. Roberts was now working with the Bureau of Indian Affairs to develop educational programs that honored Native American cultural traditions while providing practical skills for navigating an increasingly complex world.
"Dear Margaret," the letter had read, "your students have taught us all something crucial about the relationship between safety and learning. Children cannot develop their full potential in environments dominated by fear, but they can achieve remarkable things when given genuine protection and respect. The policies being implemented because of your courage will protect thousands of children we may never meet. Thank you for refusing to accept that institutional cruelty was inevitable."
Margaret's left hand trembled as she reread those words, but the tremor felt different now, less like weakness than like the vibration of a tuning fork responding to truth. She had learned that her physical condition, once a source of shame, could serve as an indicator of when situations required her full attention and advocacy. The final entry in her journal that night captured the essence of what had been accomplished at Fort Huachuca. We have proven that institutions, built on fear and control, are not only morally wrong but practically ineffective. Children learn better, families thrive more, and communities grow stronger when authority serves protection rather than domination. The work of transformation is never finished, but it is always possible when enough people decide that justice matters more than convenience. Outside her window, the desert night was filled with the gentle sounds of a community at peace with itself. Tomorrow would bring new challenges as the reforms spread to other installations and the work of healing continued. But tonight, Margaret Whitmore slept knowing that she had helped create something that would outlast any individual, a proof of concept that institutions could be reformed, that children's voices mattered, and that courage in the face of injustice could create lasting change. The stars over Arizona territory shone down on a fort where children slept safely, where adults provided genuine protection, and where truth had finally found fertile ground in which to grow. It was, Margaret reflected in her final moments of consciousness, exactly the kind of legacy worth trembling for.